Many Fire Emblem games will have units whose first impressions lead players to wild misconceptions about their viability upon a first playthrough, and no example of this phenomenon is more fitting than Odin in Fire Emblem Conquest. If you look at old tier lists or unit discussions about the game when it first came out, many people found Odin unimpressive at best and downright bad at worst. The general consensus was that his growths were not all that good for use as a long-term unit, his performance at base was unimpressive, and the other first-generation mages, Nyx and Leo, were just all around much better at actually filling the role one would expect from a mage. Many even suggested that the best way to use Odin was to not even use him as a dark mage at all, but rather to heart seal him into samurai so that he can have higher speed, and be a sword master in the route where that's rarely an option. As you can probably guess, I disagree with all of those sentiments. But not only do I think that Odin isn't bad, I believe him to be a top 10 unit in Conquest and arguably the best dark mage in the game, or at least the second best. So, why do I think so highly of Odin? And why do I think so many people got it wrong when the game first came out? That's what this video is going to be about. Both my analysis of Odin as a unit, and my 2 cents on how first impressions can have such a strong effect on how people view units in this franchise. But before that, really quick, I want to mention that this video is actually being released simultaneously alongside an Odin character analysis by friend of the channel, Danny Doyle. If you want to hear someone talk about his dialogue instead of his gameplay, her video will be linked in the description. And if you're coming here from Danny's channel, welcome! I hope you enjoyed this video just as much as theirs. So, without further ado, let's get into Part 1. His bases and the early game. There's a reason I've been bringing up the concept of first impressions a lot, and that's because Odin's join map is quite possibly his worst map. Chapter 8 is a fairly large and open map filled with dark mages and fighters. This normally wouldn't be a bad proposition for Odin, except since it's his join map, he can't benefit from things like tonics unless you trade him one and have him take a turn to use it. He has to mostly rely on his bases, and unfortunately they don't do much for him here. 7 speed means he needs either a Felicia or Jacob pair-up, or a speed tonic with Niles pair-up in order to double the dark mages, who he's not one-rounding even with that. 21 HP and 6 defense means he can survive 1 hit from a fighter, but not 2. And 7 res means he's not surviving more than 2 hits from a dark mage without a res boost either. So for the most part, his contributions to this map come from using Heartseeker to improve the hit rates of your other units, and being able to do safe and accurate chip damage against the fighters. Admittedly, this is still nice, especially the Heartseeker support, since the boss of this chapter, Kilma, is on a throne, and therefore fairly dodgy. But it's hard to argue that his performance in this map is particularly good, especially compared to his fellow retainer Niles. Niles joins with enough speed to double every enemy on the map, high resistance for fighting the dark mages, and deals more chip to the fighters than Odin. Hell, with an Arthur pair-up, he can even one-round them too. Granted, Niles does have worse hit rates than his buddy, but if you trade him a bronze bow that you bought beforehand, his hit rates will largely be fixed, and will still be doing more damage than Odin. So, yeah, as you can see, not a great first map. However, Odin's performance in the following chapters see a noticeable spike, and this is for a few reasons. For one, after Chapter 8, he's freely able to benefit from things like tonics, meals, and forges just as much as any other unit, which is already helpful. But 2, and more importantly, Chapter 8 gives the player their first large sum of gold in Conquest, when up to that point they only had the 3,000 that the route starts them with. This is important because the Nosferatu tome, which is accessible in the armory from the beginning, costs 4,000 gold to purchase. Odin is only one of 2 units early on who can make use of this weapon, barring a Corrin or Niles reclass. And of the 2, he is definitely the better user of it, but we'll get to the other one a bit later. Despite being nerfed from its previous iteration in Fire Emblem Awakening, Nosferatu is still quite a strong tool in this game, allowing units to sustain themselves against many enemies at once as long as they have enough speed to avoid getting doubled, and enough magic to two-shot their opponents. If that is the case, all they want from there is some decent bulk and good hit rates, so they don't miss and fail to heal. Odin fits that bill perfectly, having pretty good hit rates, especially with Heartseeker or Weapon Triangle advantage, and good enough bulk and speed to survive with the self-healing. I'm going to be talking about Nosferatu a lot when it comes to Odin's early game, so I think it's important to take a short detour to talk about how realistic it is to buy it this early on. After all, it is 4,000 gold, which can feel like a lot when you just got 10,000 and there's several other things you could be buying. It's a point that some people bring up when talking about Odin, and how buying him Nos could be considered a significant level of favoritism. So let's examine that, shall we? Part 1.5. The cost of Nosferatu. So, let's do some quick math. Conquest starts the player off with 3,000 gold at the beginning of the route, but you also get a goddess icon from the Branch of Fate that most early units don't really need, so most players choose to sell it for an additional 1,000 gold. However, I don't just want to assume that everyone's going to sell it, since there are valid reasons to not do so. So we'll go with the conservative estimate that the player is not selling it. The villages in Chapter 8 gives 10,000 gold, and a generic Spearfighter in Chapter 9 drops an additional 3,000. So assuming the player sells absolutely nothing, that's 16,000 gold to play with before the next big sum of cash in Chapter 10. But what are we spending it on? Well, I think it's a good idea to buy a bronze axe and bronze bow to improve the accuracy of Arthur and Niles respectively. And the bow can also be given to Mozu if you want to train her, so that's 1,000 right there. There's also 2 javelins to buy, which can be very helpful for Effie and Silas, and go for 1,800 each, so we're now at 4,600 spent. Then there's the Heart Seal, which you can do all sorts of things with, like Wyvern Elise, Strategist Felisa, Archer Mozu, Corin and whatever their talent is, etc. It costs 2,000 gold, and while Haitaka in Chapter 9 does drop a second one, I think it's safe to assume most players will want to use both. So we've now spent 6,600. Let's also say that Elise or your first servant needs to replace their heal staff before Chapter 10 at some point, so that's another 500. And then let's say you've also bought some tonics to help you in Chapters 8 and 9. While everyone has different strategies that require different tonics, I'll go with the assumption that you've bought around 6 tonics in total during this time frame for another 900 gold. So we spent 8,000, which is half our total. Then you decide to make the big decision to buy Nosferatu for Odin, so that's 12,000 spent and 4,000 remaining. So even with all that, you still have 4,000 left for things like more tonics in Chapter 10, a Forge or 2, and a Master Seal if you'd like to early promote someone. And like I said earlier, that's if you don't sell anything. The Goddess Icon and less desirable items like the Brass Naginata can be sold for additional cash to spend if you so choose. All in all, I'd say that the game gives you plenty of money to buy Nosferatu along with everything else you'd want in the early game, even without selling things. I understand how the price tag of Nos might turn some people off to the idea of buying it, but after doing the math, I really don't think it's fair to say that it's too costly to buy for Odin, especially considering the value one gets out of it throughout the whole game. Now, with that out of the way, let's get back to talk about Odin himself. So, now that we've established that Nosferatu is a reasonable purchase to make, what does Odin even do with it starting in Chapter 9? Well, his combat immediately sees improvement against the map's archers, whose low resistance and triangle disadvantage against tomes make them easy for Odin to Nos tank. He does 10 damage to them at base, so any source of damage that gives him 2 or more attack, like a magic tonic, allows him to 2-round them while sustaining himself. Now, this doesn't entirely work against the starting formation of enemies due to the presence of the Spearfighters, who he does less damage to and gets debuffed by them thanks to having sealed defense. However, the archers in Haitaka's room are a different story. They attack your enemies over the wall, have good defense thanks to Haitaka's rally, and one of them has a shining bow for hitting someone like Effie where it hurts. There's also the Shrine Maiden with an Enfeeble staff who's positioned specifically to be able to debuff any of your units who wish to fight the archers over the wall. The archers are also relatively low leveled and have Underdog for additional avoid against most of your units. While there are multiple units capable of getting the job done, Odin is generally your most consistent option. He has better resistance than someone like Silas or Effie for the Shining Bow guy, but better defense than someone like Felicia or Nyx for the Steel Bow ones. His Weapon Triangle advantage helps with hit rates, and so does his lower level. You need to be level 7 or lower for Underdog to not activate, and since Odin starts at level 5 and isn't doing much on Chapter 8, this is fairly likely to be the case. All the archers have low resistance, and Nosferatu allows him to heal during enemy phase to safely deal with them. Enfeebled does mean he'll need a bit of help, but it's pretty reasonable for him to get it done. Any boost to speed allows him to not get doubled after debuffs, and a pair up along with Lily's Poise and potentially Felicia's Demoiselle give him enough bulk to survive. As for Hitaka himself, he's even more dodgy than Kelma, and a potential capture target, so Heartseeker is even more valuable here than last chapter. Nyx has it too, but she gets one-shot by Hitaka without any support, whereas Odin survives a hit with none, and she has worse hit against him compared to Odin too. Now, I wouldn't call Odin's performance on this map stellar. He still faces some issues. He has trouble facing the Spearmasters head-on and gets doubled by the Samurai, leaving him with not much to do against them except for chip damage and Heartseeker support. Still, his genuinely good performance against the archers, particularly the most dangerous one in Hitaka's room, as well as the boss himself, make him quite nice to have here, to the point it doesn't really feel like you're dragging him around like you were on the last chapter. But here's where it gets fun for Odin, as now we have Paralogue 1 and Invasion 1. Paralogue 1 is meant to be a grinding map, both for your existing units and for Mozu, this game's trainee. Mozu honestly deserves a video of her own, given that she's quite an interesting unit in her own right. But long story short, Mozu performs best when given a heart seal to go into Archer, as bows give her higher damage than lances and allow her to safely pick off enemies from a distance, making her easier to train. Additionally, Chapter 10 has a lot of Sky Knights who she can easily shoot down for some free training that allows your other units to focus on the other enemies. So while Mozu can get in some training on this map and probably should, you don't have to give her a ton of kills in Paralogue 1 when using her. And of course, if you've decided not to use her, you won't be getting her any kills at all. This is where your other units come in, as you can deploy all but 2 of them if doing Mozu's Paralogue after Chapter 9, and if you do it after 8, Odin gets a free deployment slot. But even if you do it after 9, I still think he's well worth bringing. Silas, Effie, and Niles see enough use in the earlier chapters, and start with a high enough level to where they'll likely be at level 10 by now, at which point they won't gain much experience from the Faceless here and are pretty set for Chapter 10. Same with Nyx if you're using her. Comparatively, some of your other units stand a lot to gain from some extra experience, such as Wyvern Elise, your First Servant, Arthur, and of course Odin. And using Odin on this map is basically effortless. The Faceless don't double him, have lower resistance than defense, and they all attack at 1 range, so he'll have perfect hit rates thanks to Heartseeker. Any pair-up that gives him some amount of magic or defense, or tonics in those same areas, allow him to fight the monsters very easily, and earn a couple levels while doing so, while still leaving plenty of room for Mozu and a couple other units to get their training in as well. Invasion 1 is much the same, with most of your units being able to be deployed for some last-minute training before Chapter 10, against some fairly easy-to-take-out enemies. The Wyverns, with their non-existent res and low speed, could even allow Odin to one-round them without a counter, as long as he has a bit of speed support. If you've been using Odin consistently, he's pretty likely to hit level 10 before Chapter 10, in which case his average stats will look like this. Keep in mind that the level 10 skill for Dark Mages is Malefic Aura, which effectively gives him +2 magic. These aren't bad stats by any means for this point. Solid mixed bulk and good skill and luck allow him to Nos tank pretty effectively, and an effective 13 magic alongside with probably having C and Tomes mean he has 21 attack with Nosferatu unsupported, which is already enough to chew around the archers and Oni Savages on Chapter 10. 9 speed unsupported is also enough to not get doubled by any enemies on that chapter except for Hinata, the ninjas, and the Sky Knights that have Darting Blow. And of course, support in any of these sets via pair-up, tonics, and meals further increases capabilities here, though that's honestly not really necessary. Most of your units will need help in one stat or another to do big work on Chapter 10, since it's an all-hands-on-deck sort of affair. But there's a section on the top left end of the map where a bunch of Oni Savages keep spawning in, and the section on the right where archers and spear fighters spawn. Odin can solo the Onis with Nosferatu with any pair-up and no other resources. And with a bit of support from tonics and or a meal, he could do the same to the archers and spear fighters. Being able to handle an entire section of a hectic and difficult map on his own is pretty impressive for a unit who was struggling not too long ago. And that's not all. Odin is also one of the best units to fight Takumi on this map. His triangle advantage and Heartseeker guarantees great accuracy, and Takami's low res means it's pretty easy for Odin to two-shot with Nos and a bit of magic support, with Nos also healing him in the process. While Camilla definitely still reigns supreme on this map, Odin is right up there with Silas, Effie, and Corin here in terms of being able to tackle several enemies at once and come out on top. This isn't just true for Chapter 10, it remains true for the next handful of chapters. Chapter 11 has a room with Oni savages, which Odin can clear out largely by himself, only needing a little bit of help against Rinka thanks to her warding blow. This leads to the Diviner room, which he can also easily take care of, even after taking the Hexing Rod, as long as he either stacks some res, or just waits a couple turns for seal res to wear off. Alternatively, he can also go left into the Archer room, where he also shines thanks to Nosferatu taking enough health from the archers to where your other units can kill them at one range without taking damage from the counter. Though, be wary that he doesn't perform all too well in the Ninja room, outside of providing Heartseeker against them. In Chapter 12, there are 2 pots right at the player's starting position, one which grants magic and one which grants defense, plus 4 each. Perfect for what Odin wants to do. He doesn't do that well against the ninjas, but he does very well against the apothecaries and spear fighters, and with a little speed support can avoid getting doubled by samurais as well. We could keep going, but we're starting to get to the point in the game where some of your units might want to promote, so the last chapter we'll talk about as his early game performance is Chapter 13. Where once again, he does very well. Armor Knights and Wyvern Riders are easily defeated by a bulky mage with self-healing, and the Cavs aren't much trouble either. The only units who really threaten Odin are Orochi with her high resistance and seal res, and Reyna with her similarly good res and high speed. So in summary, Odin has a rough starting chapter where he can't get too much done, aside from chip damage and reliability, then an alright chapter where he's good against key enemies, but still struggles against others, then a couple of chapters where he's pretty good and does some nice self-improvement, and then a good 4 chapter stretch where he's very useful, able to handle groups of enemies all on his own, or support his allies by baiting them in, surviving them all and dealing half their health so your other units can finish them off. Past Chapter 13 is where a lot of your units are likely to start wanting to promote, and when the player gains access to the level 2 shops, so it's hard to say exactly what tools the player would have chosen to use at this point. But for what I'd consider to be the early game, Odin has an overall pretty good record. But I know what some people might be thinking. Well, that's true, but doesn't Odin fall off? I mean, Nosferatu stops being good around the halfway point in Conquest, and Odin's growths aren't that good. Plus, Leo shows up in Chapter 14 with better bases than Odin's averages at that point, and Leo has good growths too. So why use Odin long term when you should just be using Leo instead? And those are all valid questions to ask, so let's talk about Odin's long-term potential, shall we? Part 2. His growths, his competition, and Ophelia's Paralogue. So, first things first, I need to get something off my chest. Odin's growths. I've seen at many points in the past that people will say his growths are bad, and that he's not very good long-term because his stats don't hold up. And let's talk about that, because I don't really understand that line of thinking. On screen right now are his growths while in the Dark Mage class. Now, of course, these can change depending on whether he promotes into Sorcerer or Dark Knight, or if he reclasses to a different class entirely, but seals are a limited resource, and supports take time to build, and Nosferatu isn't usable if he reclasses, so he's gonna stay in Dark Mage for a while at least. And looking at these, I struggle to see why someone would call them bad. Aside from res at 30%, all of his growths range from 45 to 60%, with 55 in HP and 45 in defense being quite good for a mage, and 55% skill and 60% luck being quite good in general. Lastly, 50% magic and 40% speed, while not super high, are by no means bad. Even his strength is sitting at a comfortable 45% in case he decides to promote to Dark Knight and make use of swords. When promoting to Sorcerer, he loses out on some of that strength growth, but that's fine because he's not really using it anyways, and gains a bit of extra magic and resistance. Dark Knight modifies his growth more dramatically, making his HP growth a pretty high 70%, and strength and defense a very good 55%. In exchange, however, his magic and speed growth drops to 40%. Overall, I prefer the promotion bonuses and growth granted by Sorcerer, but his Dark Knight ones aren't really bad either. He's actually quite comparable in growths to Laszlo, a unit with very similar growths, with the only real difference being that in their starting classes, Laszlo has a 10% higher growth in his primary offensive stat compared to Odin. Laszlo is generally considered to have pretty solid growths, so why does Odin get derided for his? I think the reason is twofold. One, with his poor performance in his join chapter and just alright performance in chapter 9, some may assume that his growths are not good enough to save him from his start. Two, some people may only be comparing his personal growths to those of other units, not realizing that you need to factor in everybody's class growths as well in order to get the full picture. Either way, I really don't see a world where Odin's growths can be reasonably considered bad. Yes, his magic and speed won't quite grow to the heights of someone like Nyx, but he has far superior stats in almost every other area, and those allow him to be far more versatile and capable than her in a lot of ways. An accurate, bulky, 1-2 range unit with decent magic and speed generally has a lot more to do on any given map than a frail mage with shaky hit rates but better player phase damage. But like I said before, when it comes to being used in the mid and late game, most people would instead be more inclined to compare Odin to his lord Leo. After all, Leo is also a mage with good bulk but a bit lacking in speed, with similar class access to Odin as well. And don't get me wrong, Leo is a great unit, whose high bases alone make him worth using. But raw stats don't tell the whole story with any unit, and these two are a perfect example of that. Leo's internal level suggests that he promoted at level 16, and he joins at a level 2 Dark Knight. So if we assume that Odin promoted to Sorcerer at level 17 so that their levels are equal, here's what his averages look like compared to Leo's. As you could see, Leo trumps Odin in just about every stat, with the exception of Odin's skill and luck being a bit higher, and the two of them having equal speed. However, there are a handful of other factors at play here that aren't visible just by comparing averages, and nearly all of them give Odin an advantage. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, Odin has plenty of time now to build up supports. His best partners, Elise, Nyx, and First Servant Felicia, have had several maps to build support with him at this point, and he should already be married even if you haven't done any paralogs, while Leo can only get started on his supports in his join chapter. This is a pretty big deal, as it gives Odin more flexibility in who he fights with since he's no longer looking to build supports with his partner, and when he's fighting with his partner, she'll give him some very strong bonuses. Second, Odin has better access to skills and classes than Leo does. They have the same support list, with the exception of Odin being able to support Camilla and Elise, while Leo obviously can't, and Leo has friendship with Xander, where Odin instead has one with Laszlo. The mercenary skills are quite good on mages, and while Leo can still get Shuriken Breaker via his friendship with Niles, he won't be able to get skills like Stronger Post, Soul, or Axebreaker unless he specifically marries Selena. In return, he gains easier access to Elbow Room, Shelter, and Defender. While these are good skills, I'd argue that for these two units, Elbow Room and Stronger Post are equivalent to one another most of the time, and I'd rather have Axebreaker or potential self-healing on weapons other than Nosferatu over another Shelter user. Lastly, you might be wondering why I made that stat comparison earlier with promoting Odin to Sorcerer instead of Dark Knight. Shouldn't they be in the same class to make it a more equal comparison? Well, you see, Odin's ability to become a Sorcerer without the need of a hard seal like Leo is another advantage he has. Sorcerer has an innate plus 10 hit bonus that makes Odin more reliable than Leo even before factoring in his higher skill and luck. Sorcerer also doesn't have a weakness to enemies with beast effectiveness, which is notable in a couple of maps like Kitsune Lair. And most importantly, Sorcerer can still use Nosferatu. This makes a big difference in any chapter where Nos is good, and trust me, there's a good amount of them even in the mid and late game. For example, Chapter 18 is a map where self-healing and 1-2 range can make a huge difference, with all the paladins and bow knights running around. And outside of lightning, you're not doubling the wary fighter generals anyways. While it's definitely possible for Leo to run in with a horse spirit and some defense stacking in enemy phase of these enemies, it's easier and less investment for Odin to whip out Nos and do the same thing. Chapter 19 is a great chapter for an accurate sorcerer like Odin, since as long as he has enough speed to avoid getting doubled, he can hit them fairly accurately and provide Heartseeker for his teammates without having to worry about being weak to Beast Foe. While he can't sweep Chapter 21 all on his own thanks to the presence of the Stoneborn, Odin with Nos can still survive quite well as long as you make sure he's not in range of multiple Stoneborn at once, or any of the Tonebreaker faceless. Lastly, Chapters 23 and 26 are the last standout chapters for Nos tanking. with 23 putting up little resistance against it as a strategy, and 26 still allowing it to be used to great effect as long as the player is mindful of Enfeeble and Hexagram. Now, this isn't to say that Leo can't ever use Nosferatu, especially since after Chapter 20 you can purchase an infinite amount of seals from the level 3 shops. But if you want him to use it before then, he'll need to use one of the 5 valuable heart seals given to the player before Chapter 20, and even afterwards it still costs some money. So Odin being able to do this for free is a noticeable boon. Also, I mentioned it in passing before, but the Horse Spirit is one of 3 very powerful tomes acquired from Ophelia's Paralogue, alongside the Calamity Gate and the Lightning Tome. Now, both Leo and Odin can make fantastic use of these tools for sure, so I don't think it's fair to argue that their existence is an advantage for Odin specifically. However, it should be noted on the topics of weapons and paralogs that these are also areas where Odin has an advantage. With all the 2-rounding he'll be doing with Nos, Odin's weapon rank will grow considerably, to the point where it's not unusual for him to cap his unpromoted tome rank at B before promoting. This means at bare minimum he'll have a full rank's worth of advantage over Leo, who starts at C tomes, and if you've promoted him before Chapter 14 to uncap his rank, he'll have even more. As for paralogs, there's a small handful of paralogs that the player is likely to be able to unlock before Chapter 14. Ophelia's and Percy's are very easy to get, same with Kana's and potentially Dwyer's, depending on what Corn's gender is and who they're marrying. Nina's and Sophie's can also be gotten during this time if the player isn't pairing Silas or Niles with someone who joins later, and if they build those supports during the aforementioned paralogs that are easy to get early. Now, I'm not going to assume that you're doing all these paralogs before Chapter 14, nor am I saying that only Odin, specifically, benefits from them. What I'm saying is that availability matters a lot in this game, even more so than most other Fire Emblem titles. When comparing Odin to Leo, it's important to recognize that there's a good chance you may have done 1 or 2 paralogs before Leo joins, in which case the stat gap closes between the two more so. So what does this all mean in practice? Essentially, it means that Leo and Odin are able to accomplish basically all the same things in any given mid-game chapter, just going about it in a bit of a different way. Odin might prefer to tank a group of enemies with Nosferatu and a magic pair-up, while Leo might prefer to do it with a horse spirit and a speed pair-up, but they'll both get the job done just as well. So what, do I think Leo is just strictly worse than Odin because he does the same things but without the early game contributions? Well, not exactly, but to talk about that, we'll have to move on to Part 3. Skills, Reclassing, and Late Game Builds. Now, while there are several possibilities for any unit to build or class in the late game, everyone has some options that are preferable to others, usually ones that accentuate their natural stats. I'm looking at Odin's averages at this point in time. He doesn't seem to have a clear direction he wants to go. Continuing the comparisons to Leo, the raw stat lead he has over Odin becomes more noticeable as the both of them grow, both because Leo also has good growth in his own right, and because he will also be able to gain supports, which was something that Odin had over him earlier. In general, this is what I would call Odin's weakest point, is that he kind of needs to grab skills from other classes in order to be particularly effective in the late game chapters. Of course, most units will want to grab skills as well, but most don't necessarily need them in the same way that Odin does. This makes him a bit costly to use at this stage of the game, since you'll need to both spend cash on seals and spend times in those classes grabbing skills. However, that latter point isn't as big of a deal for him as it would be some other units, since Odin's strength growth is actually decent, meaning he'll perform okay in whatever physical class he spends visiting for skills. If you ask me, his best options are the Samurai skills, which he has access to at base, and the Mercenary skills, which he can get through supporting last level. Samurai gives Odin Advantage, which is a very nice tool to have on any unit with 1-2 range, but can be particularly potent when combined with Nosferatu. Later on, it also provides him with Life and Death, a skill that increases damage significantly, but also makes tanking much more difficult. However, I will admit that using either of these skills on Odin does require a significant amount of investment. In order to use Vantage with tomes in the mid-game, you'll have to spend 2 of your 5 early heart seals on him, which is a pretty hefty ask, and why many players prefer to have him pass down Vantage to Ophelia in order to only spend 1 heart seal on this. Life and Death, meanwhile, encourages the unit who has it to reach enough attack power to where they can one-shot any enemy that comes their way, especially combining it with Vantage. And while Odin's great hit rates makes him very reliable in this role if he does have enough attack, he's generally worse at hitting those one-shot thresholds than someone like Leo or Ophelia. So while Odin does appreciate having access to these skills, he generally isn't going to become one of your key late-game units through them unless you give him a significant amount of support from things like Seals and Spirit Dusts. That's why I generally prefer giving him the skills from Mercenary. Strong Riposte helps his enemy phase damage a lot with no downside attached. Shuriken Breaker can be used alongside Calamity Gate to effectively fight ninjas, and Soul isn't just good on your own ninjas. Mages can also double with 1-2 range, and it can allow Odin to recover HP in the middle of a fight with weapons other than Nosferatu. It also doesn't require a Heart Seal to put Odin into these classes, only a Friendship Seal. There are other options as well, such as marrying Camilla to access Malignite, or Effie to gain defensive skills to assist with non-tanking like Defense +2 or Wary Fighter. But I find that generally, Odin does not get as much from marriage as he does from friendship and his own base class set. Generally speaking though, I do have to admit that I find Leo to generally be your better option for a magical late game carry. His higher magic allows him to more effectively utilize skills like Vantage and Life and Death himself, with these skills being pretty accessible for him due to his fast Odin friendship. And when reclassed into Sorcerer and given a speed backpack like Nyx or Felicia, he can double a surprising amount of things while still having decent bulk. In general, Leo also just needs less help from skills like Strong Riposte to reach run-rounding thresholds, and the hit bonus from Sorcerer helps to increase his reliability. Don't get me wrong, Odin is still perfectly good in the late game and very fun to use, but I find Leo to generally scale better thanks to his higher magic and easy access to tools that he can make better use of than Odin can at that point. But on the topic of reclassing, you might have noticed that I failed to mention something. A concept that I brought up at the beginning of this video that was suggested by many players at the time of the game's release. I haven't talked yet about Odin's performance if you decide to instantly hard seal him into Samurai and make him into a magical combat unit. After all, it does give him more speed and allows him easier access to Vantage. Plus he can make use of his still decent magic stat in Swordmaster with the Levin Sword. So let's talk about that. Actually, no. Scratch that. Allow me to rant for a moment, would you? Because I need to get this off my chest. I need to explain in great detail why turning Odin into a Samurai is one of the absolute worst decisions you can make with this unit, and why this advice is a huge trap to people less familiar with Fates and Fire Emblem as a whole. Part 3.5. Please God keep the man in Dark Mage. Okay, so here are Odin's bases and growths when instantly reclassed to Samurai. Starting with the growths, these aren't bad really, but they also aren't all that different from his growths in Dark Mage. His speed growth, while higher, isn't that much higher at only 10% more, and his strength growth is actually slightly less than his Dark Mage magic growth. The only other noticeable difference is higher skill and luck growths, but those were already above average in Dark Mage and weren't really the areas he needed improvements in. Moving on to bases, they are less inspiring to say the least. Since he's stuck with E-Swords, his starting attack without a forge is a measly 13, with most enemy types having higher defense than resistance. 12 speed allows him to double the Dark Mages on his join map, although in order to one-round him he needs an Arthur para-up. And because he now hits on defense, he deals less damage to the fighters on the map unless he's given a speed para-up to double them, and he can no longer attack them from range. That last point is a big problem with Samurai Odin in general. You're giving up not only damage in cases when you're not doubling, but also 1-2 range and weapon ranks, not to mention Nosferatu. Everything we talked about before with his early game contributions changes, because he can no longer heal himself during combat, he can no longer enemy phase archers, and he can no longer leverage Malefic Aura to boost his own attack. And in general, he fills a role that doesn't need filling. If you need a fast physical unit who attacks mostly on player phase due to having a lack of 1-2 range, Niles uses a stronger weapon type, has better speed and strength, has a level 10 skill that he can actually take advantage of, and can deal effective damage against flyers. The only thing Odin has over him in this role is better hit rates. And if that's the only quality you have over another units, things aren't looking too good. You might argue that it's still good to put Odin into Samurai because it gives your army more diversity. You already have other units who can be Dark Mages, and Swordmaster is a rare class in Conquest that not many units have access to. But the thing is, there's no reason that you have to have a large variety of classes as possible. Yes, you want units who are capable of fulfilling different roles, but as we just talked about with Niles, you can fill a certain role with different classes, and the role of a fast physical unit who attacks on player phase is not exclusive to Swordmasters. In nearly every respect, Samurai Odin is less versatile and less effective at contributing in the early chapters than Dark Mage Odin. Admittedly, when trained, you can potentially get something nice out of Samurai, since he can either use his decent magic with the 11 sword in Swordmaster, or leverage his great hit rates and decent bulk in Master of Arms. That latter option is surprisingly useful in Chapter 19, where he can combine the Beast Killer with Vantage, Heartseeker, and his hit rates to be an arguably better sweeper of the map than someone like Wyvern Xander due to his higher reliability. However, I'll be honest, I don't think this is worth it. Part of why I'm so positive about Odin as a unit is that his bad start doesn't actually last for very long, and he can use Nosferatu in one-tune range to contribute as early as Chapter 9 and perform very well throughout most of the early and mid-game chapters. In Samurai, his start isn't much better, and he's much less useful in a lot of chapters, especially key ones like 10 or 16. Even if he performs decently after promotion, it's hard to be impressed with that when Dark Mage makes him better and does so earlier. Now don't get me wrong, if you want to art seal him because you think it's fun or cool, by all means go ahead. I'm not going to stop you, have fun. I'm just trying to argue that if we're talking about what's best for the unit's performance, it's hard to call it a good option. Especially once you factor in that a Heart Seal is a competitive resource that someone like Mozu, Elise, Korin, hell even Nyx could benefit from more. Part 4. So, how good is he anyways? So after all that comparing, all the breaking down of growths, averages, comparisons to other units, all this stuff, how good do I really think Odin is? Is he truly the best mage in the game? Well, to answer that last question, probably not. Although I do think him and Leo are very similar in terms of how good they are, I currently value Leo's high bases you get for free and his great late game a little more than Odin's early game contributions. Still, on a tier list of the game's units, I'd place them right next to one another. They're both really good. And if we include units who don't start in the Dark Mage class line, I'd put Elise over both of them anyways as a mage for her combination of combat and utility contributions. But I do think that Odin is a top 10 unit in the game. His great availability, reliable hit rates, access to a very strong weapon type, and all-around solid contribution across the campaign make him a unit who's hard to say no to. Even if you don't want to use him the whole game, it's still perfectly viable to use him early on, make good use of him during the early chapters, and then once you've unlocked Ophelia's Paralogue, you can dump him for her or Leo, and they'll do a great job from there. He's one of many units in the series who can leverage their unique and positive traits to make themselves useful, despite having lackluster-looking stats. Similar to someone like Bernadetta, or Micaiah, or FE1 Jacob. It just goes to show that raw numbers don't tell the whole story. Bases might be better than growths, but context is better than both. And in the context of Conquest, Odin is a remarkably strong unit. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more unit breakdowns like this for Conquest, don't worry. I have several other units who I have plans for, with the videos about them being similar in concept to this one. In fact, leave a comment telling me who you'd most want to see if you're interested. I'll never turn down the opportunity to talk about this game and the characters within it, especially if people want to hear. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.